All right, listeners, buckle up, because today we're diving into some seriously deep waters, the kind of stuff that'll make you question everything you thought you knew about science and ethics.
Yeah, this one's a doozy.
We're talking designer
It's straight
babies.
out of a sci-fi movie, right?
Right. Except this isn't science fiction anymore. It's getting real, people.
Yeah.
And we're not just talking about some abstract what ifs here. We're going deep into an academic paper that lays out the ethics of it all in a way that's, frankly, kind of mind blowing.
Yeah, and get this, it all revolves around this concept called procreative beneficence.
Procreative. Okay, gotta love those academic terms, always a mouthful. So break it down for us. What is this procreative beneficence all about?
Well, on the surface, it sounds pretty straightforward. It's this idea that parents have a duty to actually choose the child out of all the possible children they could have who's expected to have the best possible life.
Okay, so hold on, let me get this straight. Like, if you had two embryos and you could somehow know one was gonna be like the next Einstein.
Well, it's not quite that simple, but you're on the right track.
Mhm.
Think of it more like you've got two schools to choose from for your kid, right? One's just average, the other one's like known for setting kids up for success. Which one are you picking?
The better school, obviously.
Uh-huh.
I want my kid to thrive, not just survive. But how does that connect to, like, gene editing? That feels like a whole other level.
And that's exactly the point this paper is making. It argues it's the same basic principle, just on a way bigger scale.
Mhm.
It's all about maximizing your child's potential for a good life. And here's where it gets really wild. This whole argument hinges on this other concept called consequentialism.
Okay, there's always another concept. Gotta love it. Consequentialism. Lay it on me. What's that all about?
So imagine you've got to make a choice between two actions, right? One just feels instinctively right, but then the consequences turn out kind of disastrous. The other one, maybe it feels wrong at first, but ultimately it leads to a good outcome. Which one would you say is the more morally sound choice?
Okay, I see where you're going with this. So consequentialism says it's not about your gut feeling, it's the end result that matters most.
Exactly. And that's the lens this paper wants us to look through when we think about genetic enhancement. It's all about the outcome, a child with the best possible shot at a good life.
So we're saying how we get there, whether it's picking an embryo or using CRISPR to tweak some genes, might not actually be the core ethical issue here. It's more about the ends justifying the means.
You got it.
Okay, you've officially blown my mind. So we're saying parents have this duty to create the quote-unquote best possible child, and this whole consequentialism thing is saying the how might not really matter. I can already see where this gets ethically dicey. It's hot fast. Okay, so I'm trying to wrap my head around all this. On one hand, we have procreative beneficence, which is like go for the best possible kid. And on the other hand, consequentialism is like, as long as the outcome is good, it doesn't matter how you get there.
You know, you're really getting to the heart of it. And the paper actually lays out this really structured argument. You could almost say it's like a mathematical proof. And the point of this proof is to show how accepting those two ideas that you just laid out logically leads you to support genetic enhancement.
Okay, I'm not exactly a math whiz, but I'm always down for a good proof, so lay it on me. How does it all add up?
Well, they break the argument down into these numbered points, almost like a legal case, you know what I mean? And it starts with this first premise. Parents have this moral obligation to select the child out of all the ones they could have who's expected to have the best life.
So that's just procreative beneficence summed up in a neat little box.
Precisely. Premise one, check.
All right, what's next?
Okay, so premise two kind of follows naturally from that first one. Basically, it just says that when parents follow procreative beneficence, the end result is a child who is expected to have a better life than if they hadn't.
Okay, yeah, that makes sense. But I'm still not quite seeing how we're jumping from picking an embryo to, like, actually editing genes. Those seem like two totally different things.
And this is where premise three comes in, and honestly, it changes the whole game. Remember consequentialism.
Of course. Don't let me off the hook that easy.
Haha. All right, just making sure. Well, if two actions have the same moral outcome, they're basically the same, ethically speaking.
Okay, I think I might be picking up what you're putting down here. Are you saying that choosing a, like, better embryo and using genetic enhancement to create a better child, they both have the same goal in mind? They lead to the same outcome.
Exactly. They both are aiming for that best possible life outcome for the child. And the paper is saying that the method might not actually matter so much from a moral standpoint if you buy into those first 3 points.
So if you're on board with procreative beneficence and you're vibing with consequentialism, boom, you have to support designer babies. That's a pretty strong statement.
It is bold, and I think the paper knows that because they actually dedicate a significant portion of their argument to uh, addressing potential objections to this line of thinking. It's
Yeah.
almost like they knew people would be like, hold on a second, there's a huge difference between these two things.
Yeah, and to be fair, I feel like that's most people's gut reaction to this. It feels like a big leap to go from one to the other. So what kind of objections are we talking about here? What are people freaking out about?
Well, they go through a whole list of concerns, like how much control do we actually have over genes? What are the risks involved? And then there are the larger societal implications of it all.
Okay, before my head explodes, let's take a breath and go through these one by one. This is the part where I think everyone listening is like, but wait a minute, what about the argument that gene editing gives us way too much control? Like, isn't that crossing a line, making it fundamentally different from just selecting an embryo?
It's a great point, and the paper addresses it directly. They say that we need to be really careful about the definition of enhancement that we're using. We're not talking about, like, designing a superhuman baby with every single trait perfectly predetermined like some kind of, like sci-fi nightmare. It's not about guaranteeing a Nobel Prize winner. What we're talking about is increasing the chances of a good life. And to them, a good life means a life full of well-being, of opportunity, all that good stuff. So if a genetic tweak leads to that better life, it counts as an enhancement, regardless of how big or small that tweak might be.
So it's less about playing God and more about removing roadblocks and giving a kid a better shot at life. Okay, I can see that. But even if that's the case, there's still this other big concern, the risks. We don't know everything about genes. What if we mess something up?
Oh, absolutely. That's a huge concern. And the paper acknowledges it. But, and this is the big but, their argument only applies to enhancements that have been proven to increase well-being. So if we don't know enough about a particular genetic tweak, or we know that it's risky, then it wouldn't be considered a moral obligation under this framework.
Okay, that makes sense. You wouldn't want to gamble with a child's future, right? But still, even with the best intentions in the world, things can still go wrong. We are talking about the very building blocks of life here. Isn't there always going to be a chance of some unintended consequences?
And this is where the paper takes, in my opinion, a very interesting turn. They acknowledge that, yes, enhancement does have this potential for harm in a way that selecting an already existing embryo does not. But, and here's where it gets really interesting, they then flip the script completely and ask, what about the harm of not enhancing, when we actually have the power to prevent suffering or to give a child a better life?
Whoa, okay, hold on. My brain just did a 180. So you're saying if you could prevent a child from inheriting a debilitating disease but you choose not to, that's morally equivalent to causing harm? That's intense.
Yeah, it's some seriously heavy stuff, right? And believe it or not, that's not even all of it. The paper goes on to address even more objections like, what does this all mean for a child's freedom, for equality in society as a whole? This isn't just about one child anymore, you see. It starts to get a lot bigger very quickly.
I am definitely going to need a minute to process all of this. These are some big, big questions. And listeners, if your heads aren't already spinning, just wait, because we are about to go even deeper into this ethical maze. When we come back, we're going to tackle even more objections, even more implications, and hopefully, just maybe, we'll even find some answers. Stick around. All right, we're back, and honestly, my brain is still a little fried from that last part. Procreative beneficence, consequentialism, designer babies. We are really in the thick of it now.
It's a lot to unpack, isn't it? And,
Yeah.
it's one thing to follow the logic of an argument, but it's another thing entirely to actually feel good about it.
Yeah.
And this paper, I got to give them credit. They don't shy away from the really tough questions, like the objections they bring up. Seriously challenging stuff.
And that's what makes this so fascinating, right? We're not here for the easy answers. We're here to really grapple with this. So let's talk about freedom. This has always been a big one for me when it comes to genetic enhancement. Like, what about a child's right to choose who they become? If we're already optimizing their genes, haven't we kind of robbed them of some autonomy?
Oh, it's a huge question. And it's one that the paper actually turns on its head a bit. Because their argument is that these enhancements, in a lot of ways, are actually more like a good education. They can actually increase a child's autonomy.
Hold on, really? How does that work?
Well, think of it this way. Let's say you've got a kid who's genetically predisposed to being really healthy and strong. They might have more opportunities to pursue, say, a career in athletics, right? Or maybe they have a natural aptitude for music. Well, enhancements could help them reach their full potential in that area. It's about removing limitations, not necessarily imposing them.
So it's less about dictating who a child will be and more about giving them the tools to actually explore a wider range of possibilities. Okay, I can see that. But even if we can get on board with that, there's still this other huge, huge issue looming over all of this: equality. Because even if we decide, yeah, this technology is ethically A-okay, wouldn't it just end up making the gap between the haves and the have-nots even worse?
It's a crucial point, and thankfully, the paper doesn't shy away from it. They address it head on. But their take is interesting. They argue that the problem isn't really with the technology itself, but with access. So what they're advocating for is policies that would ensure equal access to these enhancements for everyone.
So kind of like a universal healthcare system, but for gene editing. Like everyone deserves the chance to be their best selves, not just those who can afford it.
You get it.
Okay, I can definitely get on board with that. But let's talk about, the elephant in the room here. The impact this could all have on society as a whole. Because what if enhancing individuals actually ends up harming us all in the long run? Like it's that classic sci-fi trope, right? Suddenly everyone is a super genius and no one can relate to each other anymore.
Oh, yeah. The fear of unintended consequences on a massive scale. And to be fair, it's not like the paper dismisses this concern. They acknowledge that it's definitely something to consider. While they are primarily focused on this moral obligation of the parents to their children, they also emphasize the need to think carefully about the potential societal impacts. It's a really delicate balancing act.
So no easy answers then, huh? Just a whole lot to think about.
It's true, and honestly, that's one of the things I appreciate most about this paper. They're not trying to hand you a prepackaged set of right and wrong answers. What they're doing is pushing you to examine your own assumptions, to think critically about the kind of future we're creating, and honestly just to grapple with what it even means to be human in an age where we have this level of control over our own biology.
You're right. And on that note, I think we've given our listeners plenty to chew on today. This has been, without a doubt, one of our most mind-bending deep dives yet. But here's the thing that really gets me. This isn't some far-off sci-fi dilemma anymore. These are decisions that we as parents, as scientists, as policymakers, as a society will have to face sooner than we think.
It's not even a question of if anymore, it's a question of when and how.
Yeah.
And being prepared for that moment is, well, it's a little daunting.
It really is. And that brings us to the biggest question of all. What kind of future are we creating? And maybe even more importantly, who gets to decide?
Big questions. And maybe, just maybe, having these kinds of conversations now, even if they're uncomfortable, is how we start finding the answers.
I couldn't agree more. Thanks for joining us on this wild ride, listeners. And remember, keep asking those tough questions. Until next time, stay curious.